Evidence has come to light that Pope John Paul II was involved in a secret forbidden romance with a married woman. The pontiff fell in love with a Polish-American woman. The two of them exchanged what can only be described as letters for years. Her name was Anna Teresa Tymieniecka. The pair first met in the 1970s, just before Cardinal Karol Wojtyła was Pope. They were both in their 50s already, involved in a philosophical study together. They must have hit it off pretty well, because even after Anna Teresa married in 1995, she remained close to Karol. They remained friends as he became Pope in 1978, and continued to be friends up until John Paul's death in 2005. Anna herself passed on in 2014. There were already rumors about Pope John Paul breaching his vow of celibacy. These rumors had been around in the 2000s, but the Vatican denied them. Anna also denied that the pair had a romantic relationship before her death. But the new correspondence paints them both as potential liars. The letters show that for 32 years, the Pope had a secret relationship with the Polish philosopher. But John Paul and Anna were most certainly cuckoo for one another. The Pope wrote in his letters that he was struggling with their relationship. He said he believed that Anna was a gift to him from God. He even made up an excuse for the way he was behaving. One of his letters says something along the lines of, "If I did not believe you were a gift from God, that I would never dare act like this." These letters are not on display to the public. It was the BBC who got a hold of them and made the information in them public. But the BBC weren't given all of them. They only saw some of the letters written by the former Pope. They didn't get any of the letters written by Anna. The original Jesus Christ was a pagan god. The biblical account of Jesus is a work of fiction in which the character Jesus is based on a much older and much drunker deity. Scholars like Timothy Freke, who co-authored several books on the subject. Timothy and his colleagues wrote that Jesus Christ was a direct copy of Dionysus, the god of wine, ritual madness, ecstasy, cultivation, and fertility. Of course, scholars have connected the story of Jesus to the story of many gods. It's been suggested Jesus was a copy of Osiris from ancient Egypt. Jesus' origin story is shockingly similar to the story of Adonis and Attis, and even the mystery deity Mithras. Pieces of the Jesus story can be found in many tales from the pagan world before Christianity. Supporters of the theory claim Dionysius was born of a virgin and that he rose from the dead. But one of the biggest links is wine. Jesus turned water into wine, and Dionysius was the god of wine. Religious scholars will deny any similarities between Jesus and Dionysus until they run out of breath. The Vatican will never admit that Jesus Christ was based on a pagan myth. Kathleen Chambers had a traumatic experience giving birth to her stillborn baby. As she lay in a hospital recovering from the horrors of what she had just experienced, her husband Jim was taking their son to be buried. He arrived at the bog at the bottom of Milltown Cemetery. The bog was not technically in the cemetery, but at the edge of it away from the official graves. The gravedigger took the box from Jim's hand, the box containing the stillborn child. Then the gravedigger threw the box into a pit and shoveled some mud on it. Years later, when Kathleen tried to find the grave, it was impossible. The stillborn child was lost in the swamp. This is a story of scandal and the Roman Catholic Church in Northern Ireland. Kathleen's stillborn baby was one of thousands that were buried in mass graves at the bottom of Milltown Cemetery. Many of the children perished because of complications. Others died in the mother and baby homes Ireland is now notorious for. These were homes where unmarried women who got pregnant could be stashed in secret to avoid scandal. Then, when they gave birth, their babies were buried in the bog. This was happening from the beginning of the 20th century until around the 1990s. And yes, it was all because of the Roman Catholic Church. In the early part of the 20th century, you couldn't find a much more strictly religious place in the whole of Europe than Ireland. Because the Catholic Church held the belief that an unbaptized child couldn't be buried on consecrated grounds, people with stillborn children were left burying their babies in bogs. And so were women who had unwanted pregnancies and could not have their babies baptized. Thomas the Apostle was not the most popular of Jesus Christ's 12 disciples. He might even be considered the least popular apostle. His nickname, Doubting Thomas, has remained a popular thing to call someone who doesn't believe in something for centuries. He earned the nickname when he refused to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Not much is mentioned about Thomas in the Gospels. He only speaks in one of them, and very rarely. However, some scholars think Thomas may have been the most important apostle of them all. Thomas may have been a second Jesus. The one thing the Gospels say about Thomas a lot is that he is somebody's twin. In fact, the original language of the Gospels names Thomas as Didymus, which is a word that literally translates to twin. The rest of the important information comes from the extra-canonical book, The Acts of Thomas. The ancient text has one passage in which Thomas and Jesus attend the same wedding. The groom mistakes Jesus for Thomas because the pair looked identical. In another forbidden biblical text called the Book of Thomas the Contender, Thomas is downright labeled Jesus' twin. In this book, Jesus chooses Thomas as his heir and passes on his divine and mystic knowledge of the universe. How shocked would you be to learn that Jesus Christ was buried in a small town in northern Japan? Every year, about 20,000 pilgrims visit the small town of Shingo to visit the grave of Jesus Christ. The local legend is that after all the chaos of Israel, Jesus escaped to live a peaceful life. He traveled far into the east where he landed in Japan and settled down to be a garlic farmer. He fell in love with a local woman called Miyuko. They had 3 children, and Jesus died at the age of 106. Outside the little farming village, he was buried in a mountain tomb. The name on the tomb isn't Jesus of Nazareth, it's Daitenku Taro Jurai. There isn't any proof, only legends. The story says that Jesus Christ studied in Japan during the years missing from the Bible. Pope Boniface VIII, the pope who was so evil, people thought he worshipped the devil. Boniface was directly related to several earlier popes, so he earned his position through nepotism. He was more concerned with status and wealth than religious matters. Pope Boniface VIII was all about securing his family's future by making sure they all had important positions. Dante Alighieri, the author of Dante's Inferno, wrote that Boniface VIII was such a disastrous pope that his seat on the papal throne was an offense to heaven, an offense that condemned all of humanity to chaos. Dante really believed that just by being pope, Boniface was plunging society into the fires of hell. Let me take you through the horrible things Boniface did, starting with his first act as the official pontiff. Right away, he imprisoned his predecessor in a cell and left him there to rot until he died at the age of 81. The first thing he did as the right hand of God was imprison the old pope in a box to suffer. Boniface involved himself in just about every affair in Europe. He spent his days butting his nose into every little thing he could, constantly forcing himself in situations. He believed every living creature needed to submit to his rule. He wasted church money on buying his family property and holdings. He declared a crusade in 1297, though it was not a religious crusade. This one was to take more territory. He was acting more like a Roman emperor than a pope. But it was this same greed that would see him defeated. He was making moves to lay France under his power, which King Philippe was not super happy about. Before the Pope could do any more damage, the king captured him and threw him in jail. A month later, in October 1303, Boniface was found dead. The Shapira scroll was labeled a forgery almost as soon as it was discovered. For over 100 years, the scroll has been a source of serious controversy. The issue is that it adds an additional line to the 10 Commandments, technically making them the 11 Commandments. A man by the name of Moses Wilhelm Shapira gained possession of the scroll through some mysterious circumstances. It was brought to him in pieces by a Sheikh Bedouin, who himself claimed the scroll was discovered by Arabs who were hiding in a cave near the Dead Sea. In the back of the cave, the Arabs discovered several bundles wrapped in ancient linen. Inside the bundles were black fragments, which when put together made up the Shapira scroll. The Arabs who found the fragments didn't know what to do with them, but understood they were important. This was how they ended up in the possession of Moses. Moses was a renowned archaeologist who had already been in a bit of trouble. He had discovered some ancient Moabite artifacts earlier, but was denounced as a fraud by Constantine Schlottmann, another academic. The accusation turned out to be wrong, and Shapira's artifacts were confirmed as real, but it had left a stain on his reputation. In 1878, when Shapira first showed off the scroll from the Dead Sea, once again he was called a fraud. In total, the scroll consisted of 15 leather strips. The strips were covered in faint Hebrew writing. There were lines from Deuteronomy, which were similar enough to other versions not to be totally unbelievable. It was the addition of the 11th commandment that really made scholars freak out. The new line read, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. I am God, your God." The other 10 commandments were all the same as normal, but this version also forbade hating your brother in your heart. Moses Shapiro was chased out of everywhere he tried to make the scrolls known. He presented them to scientists in Germany, and they called him a liar and a forger. Then he took the scroll to London, where experts at the British Museum also called it a forgery. He was driven to despair and fled, leaving behind the manuscript. 6 months later, he was discovered dead at his hotel in Rotterdam. One of the last things he wrote was a letter to one of the scientists who called him a liar. The letter said something along the lines of, "You have made a fool of me. I shall not be able to survive this shame." The manuscript is not a forgery. Then he was dead, and suddenly the manuscript disappeared.